Hello everyone, welcome to this revision presentation on the inquiry Seething Brew, Why Did Europe Descend into War in 1939? So there is an image of Christopher Isherwood, who was a British novelist, and he moved to Berlin in 1929 at the age of 25. He was gay and became part of the vibrant and creative Berlin of the 1920s and 1930s. In the 1970s, he wrote about his time in Berlin. When he described Berlin in the 1930s, he said, "Here was the seething brew of history in the making." By 1939, the seething brew of lots of different events and factors had led to war breaking out in Europe once again in 1939. And that's what our inquiry is all about, to explain the causes of the Second World War. So here's a chronological focus of the work that we're doing. So you can see here shaded in green is the interwar period, which is the focus of the events that we are learning about in this inquiry. We can see that it's called the interwar period because it is the period in between World War I and World War II. After the Second World War, of course, was the Cold War, which lasted from 1945 until 1991. And there's some images of some key important information that affected the world in the 20th century. So key historical concepts that you need to be aware of in order to understand this inquiry. Here's 16 of the key ones. So appeasement is giving people what they want to keep them happy. This was the policy towards Germany before the Second World War. An armistice is a ceasefire, an agreement to stop fighting. And this is what happened on the 11th of November 1918 at the end of the First World War. Communism is a way of running a country where all wealth is shared by its people. In 1917, there was a communist revolution in Russia, leading to it becoming the Soviet Union. Democracy is when people get to choose their own government. It literally translates as rule by the people. A dictator is when someone runs a country on their own, where there's no democracy or rights. Fascism, a way to run a country, usually associated with extreme nationalism. And that's what we would call Germany and Italy during the interwar period. They would be regarded as fascist countries. Great Depression was the time when the economy failed. Lots of people lost their jobs and there was less money. This is what Europe was like, and America in the 1930s. Hyperinflation, when the price of goods increases dramatically. This is what happened to Germany in 1923. Ideology is a belief in how a country should be run. League of Nations, an international organisation set up to promote peace, began its work in 1920. Nationalism, belief your country is the best, you may go to war in order to prove this. There's a real increase in nationalism and countries focusing on their own interests in the interwar period. Propaganda, poster, adverts or radio broadcasts which are used to influence people's political opinions. Rearmament is manufacturing arms and increasing the size of the army. This is something that Germany does once Hitler becomes the leader after 1933. Reparations is the fine that Germany had to pay as a result of World War I. Treaty is an agreement between two or more countries, such as the Treaty of Versailles. And the stab in the back myth is the belief that Germany had not been properly defeated in World War I. So this slide just reminds you of the different lessons that we have learnt about in our inquiry on the Seething Brew, why Europe descended into war in 1939, including, of course, the homework that we learnt about, which was our Meanwhile Elsewhere on the Spanish Civil War. So in our first lesson, we learnt about how the First World War cast a long shadow between 1918 and 1939. We began to look at the key historical concepts of League of Nations, treaty, armistice, and the interwar period. We used the historian Robert Gerwarth, who has written a book called The Vanquished, Why the First World War Failed to End. And the historian Robert Gerwarth argued that the interwar period should not be called that because there were conflicts during this time period, such as the Russian Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, as well as Japan invading Manchuria, and later on the rest of China, and of course Italy invading Abyssinia in 1935. We learned in this lesson about how World War I ended on the 11th of November 1918 and how the armistice was signed. We learned about the Treaty of Versailles and how it was signed on 28th of June 1919, and it brought peace between the nations, although we know that Germany is very angry about it. And we also learned in that lesson about the real significance and importance of the Wall Street crash, of October 1929, which led to an economic collapse, which is known as the Great Depression, which led to huge problems of unemployment and caused real economic problems in Europe and the world in the 1930s, and can be seen as a key reason why things like Japan invading Manchuria happened, why Hitler was able to become the leader of Germany, why countries like Britain and France were not particularly wanting to rearm themselves in the 1930s, and perhaps why they wanted to appease Hitler. So this is one of the key factors that leads to quite a lot of instability during this time, the Great Depression. So that was the arguments of the historian Robert Gerwarth, who argued that the idea of an interwar period was not correct. We then went on to learn about the Treaty of Versailles in a little bit more detail. So in lesson 2, we learned about why were so many Germans angry about the Treaty of Versailles. We talked about what the Treaty of Versailles was, the idea of November criminals, which was the name given to the politicians that signed the armistice in Germany to end the First World War. The idea of the stab in the back myth, which was the myth that Germany had not been properly defeated in World War I, but had been betrayed by the politicians in Germany. We learned about Wilson's 14 points, and we learned about the reparations, the fine that Germany had to pay under the Treaty of Versailles. So on the 28th of June, Germany was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. They had no say in the treaty. The treaty was presented to them and they had to sign it. Germany was angry because they thought the treaty would be based on the much more lenient 14 points which were created in a speech in January 1918 by the American President Woodrow Wilson. There's a map there of the Treaty of Versailles where you can see all the land that Germany lost, but Germany lost 13% of its land, including the territory of Alsace-Lorraine, to France on its western border. It had to pay massive reparations for the damage that it did during the First World War. It had to accept all the blame for starting the war, and it was only allowed 100,000 soldiers in the army. It was banned from uniting with Austria, and an area which you can see in green on that map called the Rhineland was to be demilitarized, which meant that Germany could not put any soldiers into that area. So in lesson 3, we continued from the Treaty of Versailles to talk about how angry German people were in the 1920s. Key historical concepts we covered were democracy, dictatorship, hyperinflation, and the idea of the Golden Age. So Germany in the 1920s faced huge challenges. The reparations and economic problems led to the hyperinflation crisis of 1923, when the price of goods increased dramatically. In fact, the value of the mark became so worthless that you can see their children playing with banknotes. There's a very famous story about how somebody was walking along with a wheelbarrow full of banknotes, and his wheelbarrow was stolen, but the banknotes were left behind. At the height of the crisis, $1 was worth 1 trillion marks, which is a nice statistic to remember. Some people gained, such as those with loans or lots of land. Those with lots of savings or those who were paid monthly, they lost out. Now in November 1923, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party tried to take power by force in the Munich beer hall putsch. Now putsch means an uprising. Basically the Nazis tried to take advantage of the hyperinflation crisis. The uprising, the putsch, failed. Hitler was arrested and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, where he wrote his book Mein Kampf, where he outlined all of his political ideas. From 1924 to 1929, the German economy recovered with loans from the United States of America, and there was a politician called Gustav Stresemann who made things much more stable. It was known as a golden age, which is a metaphor for Germany doing well. Yet in 1929, the Wall Street crash collapsed the world economy, leading to the Great Depression, and as Germany had borrowed lots of money from America, this had a huge impact on Germany. So in our next lesson, we learned about how Hitler used German anger to become leader of Germany. So we learned about how the Great Depression hit Germany hard. It made 6 million people unemployed and many people became poor. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came up with the promise of work and bread. You can see there on the left-hand side where it says Arbeit und Brot was an election poster which says work and bread. And the Nazi support grew so that in January 1933, Hitler became the leader of Germany. He was appointed the leader of Germany, what we call a chancellor, by the president of Germany at the time, who was called President Hindenburg. And you can see there in the table the statistics which show you how much support for the Nazis increased during this time. The Nazis also got support due to Hitler's speeches, the violence of Hitler's private army, and the fact that Hitler promised to make Germany a strong and powerful country again. Hitler was using German anger to become popular. He was their last hope. And you can see there that other famous election poster says in German, Unser letzte Hoffnung, which means our last hope. Okay, in lesson 5, we learned about the League of Nations. So key historical concepts we looked at were the League of Nations, the idea of economic sanctions, which is when the League of Nations could punish countries by not trading with them, the idea of aggression and trade. So the League of Nations was the idea of President Woodrow Wilson, and it was set up to promote international peace after World War I. When it began in 1920, though, it was missing the key countries of the United States of America, Soviet Union and Germany. Now in this lesson we looked at 3 historical cartoons to really talk about the story of the League of Nations. So we talked about how the USA not joining severely weakened the League of Nations with the so-called Gap in the Bridge cartoon. We also did a case study of Japan invading Manchuria in 1931, which the League of Nations failed to stop, and we can see there the very famous David Lowe cartoon, The Doormat, showing Japan walking all over the League of Nations. Japan subsequently quit the League of Nations in 1933, the same year that Germany did as well. We then learnt about how in 1935 the Italian leader Benito Mussolini invaded a country in East Africa called Abyssinia, which is now known as Ethiopia. Again, the League of Nations failed to stop it and its authority was gone, and we reflected on that in class by looking at the cartoon, which is known as Silence, the idea that the League of Nations had not stood up to aggressive countries, and this of course is a key contributory factor to World War II. In lesson 6 we went back to studying Germany, and we talked about what happened when Hitler became the leader of Germany. We talked about some of Hitler's main foreign policy aims. So we talked about historical concepts like Lebensraum, which means living space, that Hitler wanted to gain living space in the East when he became leader. The idea of a Großdeutschland, the idea of a big Germany uniting the German-speaking people together. Rearmament, which is making sure that you're building up your weapons and the numbers in your armed forces. And remilitarization means to put your army back into an area which had been demilitarized. So when Hitler came to power in Germany, he promised to make Germany a strong and powerful country again. In 1933, he left the League of Nations, which Germany had been allowed to join in 1926, and he began to secretly rearm. So we talked about how in class he would train people to be glider pilots, so that he was getting his Air Force, his Luftwaffe, ready. By 1939, he openly admitted to rearming. He admitted he had an Air Force called the Luftwaffe, but said he was doing so only for defensive reasons. So Hitler wanted to reunite the German-speaking peoples. You can see there a map of the different places he wanted to take control of, such as the Saar industrial area, Austria, which he tried to take in 1934 but failed because Italy stopped him from doing so, and the Sudetenland, which is an area of Czechoslovakia, which you can see on the map in red. Now, very importantly, in this lesson, we did a depth study of Hitler marching his soldiers into the Rhineland, which was an area that was demilitarized under the Treaty of Versailles. And we talked about how and why Britain and France did not stop him from doing so. And the idea that some people in Britain, some British politicians, thought that Germany was just walking into their own backyard. In lesson 7, we talked about the policy of appeasement. So historical concepts we covered were appeasement, pacifist, where the Sudetenland was, and the idea of the Munich Agreement. Now, appeasement means giving somebody what they want to keep them happy. Appeasement is most associated with the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, appeasement involves giving Germany what they wanted to keep them happy. Appeasement was all about avoiding war at virtually all costs because of the horrors of World War I. So many people were pacifists, which means they believe in peace. Now, in March 1938, Germany took control of Austria. Hitler then turned his attention to taking control of an area of Czechoslovakia where German-speaking people lived. This was called the Sudetenland. Now, it seemed in 1938 the war was likely, but Britain and France came to an agreement with Germany called the Munich Agreement, where Hitler could take control of the Sudetenland in return for promising not to take control of any other territories. War had been avoided at that time in September 1938, and Chamberlain had very famously come home and waved the Munich Agreement on a piece of paper to the British people and promised peace for our time. In lesson 8, we talked about how the war actually happened. So after Germany took control of the Sudetenland, they went back on their promises, and in March 1939 they invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. Britain and France again did nothing but promised to protect Poland if it was invaded. We looked at the Nazi-Soviet pact, the idea of the Soviet Union, what an interpretation is, a viewpoint, a historian's viewpoint. We looked at the idea of tyranny as well. So we talked about in this lesson about how Germany and the Soviet Union signed an agreement called the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which was an agreement where they promised to not attack each other for 10 years. They also agreed to divide Poland. Now this was important because it gave Hitler the confidence to invade Poland in September 1939. Britain and France realised they could no longer appease Germany when this happened, and so they declared war on Germany, and Europe had descended into war once again. And that is, if you like, the trigger cause of the Second World War. We also learned in our Meanwhile Elsewhere homework about the Spanish Civil War, which was taking place during this time. We learned about key historical concepts like abdicate, fascist, republican, nationalist, and we reinforced our knowledge of the concept of a civil war, which is obviously something we learned about in year 8 when we did the English Civil War. So the Spanish Civil War took place between 1936 and 1939. It was fought between nationalists and republicans and was partly caused by tensions brought about by the Great Depression. Now, the Spanish Civil War saw Germany and Italy give help to the nationalists and their leader, General Franco. The bombing of Guernica in April 1937 sent shockwaves across Europe as it showed the devastating impact of war on civilians. Pablo Picasso painted this famous painting of it, which you can see there in the bottom right. The Soviet Union supported the Republicans. By 1939, the nationalists had won the Civil War, and General Franco remained leader of Spain until 1975. This was significant in building international tension because it gave Germany and Italy the opportunity to practice with their forces and particularly with their air force as well. So overall, what were the main causes of World War II? Well, historians like Alan Bullock have blamed World War II on Adolf Hitler. In his book, A Study in Tyranny, Alan Bullock explains that Hitler was uniquely evil and intent on war. Other historians, such as Winston Churchill, have blamed appeasement, referring to the guilty men who failed to stand up to Hitler in the 1930s. There's lots of different reasons for the Second World War. Some people say that Hitler was to blame because of his aggressive foreign policies. Some people say appeasement was to blame because Britain and France failed to stand up to Germany when they remilitarised the Rhineland or when they signed the Munich Agreement. Some say that League of Nations is to blame because it failed to stand up to countries like Japan and Italy, and then that persuaded Hitler that he could get away with things as well. Some said the Treaty of Versailles was actually simply too harsh. This is a much more long-term underlying cause of the Second World War. French General Marshal Ferdinand Foch famously said, "This is not a peace, it's an armistice for 20 years. Some blame a more short-term cause like the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which allowed Hitler to invade Poland. And of course the Great Depression was a key underlying cause as well, which made the world poorer and more unstable and helped the rise of aggressive dictators. Okay, thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed that presentation on our inquiry question, Seething Brew, why did Europe descend into war in 1939?